Debussy, Silence and Resonance. Chapter 4 of Rhythm of Thought by Jessica Wiskus. Music as the model of meaning, of this silence from which language is made. Merleau-Ponty, the 2 unpublished notes on music. For Mallarmé, the expression of poetry lives through a fundamental musicality, through the rhythm between the relations. Thus, Mallarmé objected when he heard of Debussy's intention to set L'après-midi d'une Faun to music. He felt that he had already created the music through his poetry. Nevertheless, he accepted, by all accounts, begrudgingly, Debussy's invitation to hear the first piano reading of the Prelude, no doubt because he knew that Debussy shared with him a certain artistic sensibility, since the composer, at the time, frequented the circle of poets and artists known as Le Mardi, who convened regularly in Mallarmé's own home. There, Debussy might, on any given Tuesday evening, have enjoyed the company of James Whistler, Claude Monet, Auguste Rodin, Oscar Wilde, and Paul Valéry, all the while that Mallarmé himself held court. Yet, Debussy's own position within the circle was clearly deferential. 20 years younger than Mallarmé, Debussy was at the time a struggling musician with no significant achievement to his name. Many years after the fateful reading of the piano reduction, Debussy described the master's reaction. Quote, Mallarmé arrived looking like a soothsayer, with a Scotch plaid over his shoulder. He listened, and then there was a long silence before he said, I wasn't expecting anything like that. The music prolongs the emotion of my poem and conjures up the scenery more vividly than any color. End quote. And so, by Debussy's account, Mallarmé was surprisingly delighted with the piece. Indeed, after the premiere of the Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, with full orchestra, Mallarmé sent to Debussy a signed copy of his poem, inscribed with the dedication, Woodlander from when the world was young, if your flute was once inspired, listen to the radiance it acquired when Debussy gave it tongue. Finally, in a letter to Debussy, Mallarmé wrote, What a marvel your illustration of the Afternoon of a Faun offers no dissonance with my text, except that it goes further, truly, in nostalgia and light, with finesse, uneasiness, and richness. What is striking about Mallarmé's words to Debussy is the sense in which they suggest depth, precisely the same kind of depth presented in not only Mallarmé's work, but also that of Proust and Cézanne. Nostalgia and light make use of 2 structural doubles, one temporal, as Merleau-Ponty writes of memory in Proust, the other spatial, as Merleau-Ponty writes of visible light in Cézanne. The music's finesse and uneasiness, its movement and change, as well as its richness, conjure Merleau-Ponty's description of the generative dimension that characterizes Mallarmé's own poetry. Indeed, it is as if Debussy's music were able to give expression to exactly the musicality, the rhythmicality, that Merleau-Ponty identifies in the works of those 3 artists, but especially in the poetry of Mallarmé. In this respect, what is operative is Debussy's expressive use of silence. The silence that precedes the piece becomes a part of the piece. It, and not the sound of the flute, serve as the first event in the initiation of the rhythm. Likewise, Mallarmé had emphasized the role of silence in his own work. As we saw in Chapter 1, this silence appears in printed form as the white spaces on the page. In this preface to A Throw of the Dice, published in 1897, it should be noted 3 years after the premiere of Debussy's Prelude, Mallarmé writes that his poetry admits of a strange influence, that of music, as is heard at a concert. Several of its methods, which seem to me apply to literature, are to be found here." End quote. What Mallarmé and Debussy share, and what therefore manifests itself through their work independently, is a similar artistic receptivity to that very non-coincidence, that silence from which expression issues forth. Indeed, it becomes impossible for one to say, as one would not hesitate to say of other musical tone poems of the time, like those of Richard Strauss, that Debussy's Prelude is an imitation or representation in sound. Debussy's Prelude is not derivative. It goes further than the poem, as Mallarmé wrote to Debussy. It does not illustrate the words or narrative of the poem, but resonates with and amplifies the creative sense of poetry itself. Quote, "These nymphs that I would perpetuate, what are they but the artist's desire, the flesh of expression itself?" We could say that the Prelude serves less as an imitation and more as a double of the poem, and that from the depth between the poem and the Prelude springs the true dreams and desires of the Faun. This difference, this non-coincidence between the poem and the Prelude, highlights the contrast between an art, poetry, that had, by this time, succumbed to print, and the particular temporal movement that is music. Certainly, time holds sovereignty over the way that we experience a musical piece. In listening to music, one cannot take a second look, reread, or go back over a line. And singularly, of each moment, the past's inability to be reinstated means that repetition within the flow of the music becomes essential to the unfolding of form. Indeed, in music, form can only be said to exist to the extent that phrases and sections of music wrap around themselves in reference, thanks to the operation of memory. Music inscribes a certain temporal depth. It is not as if we might, in our mind, hear the second phrase at the same time as the first, and thereby make a comparison between the two. Yet somehow we know the second phrase to be second, because the second, as a double, always gives birth to something more. It opens up a resonance of feeling that never characterizes the singular, flat, or the linear. Like the two offset images of a stereoscope that imitate a vision of depth, two iterations of a melody take, suddenly, as the dimension of one whole phrase. Repetition in music, always non-coinciding because of the flow of time, inaugurates depth. And a great musical piece shapes this depth in multiple layers. In this sense, movement and meaning are indissociable. Indeed, it is in this way that music expresses the particular sense of mythical time that Merleau-Ponty describes in his work. And so, just as we questioned with respect to Merleau-Ponty the nature of a beginning that would serve as imitation in mythical time, we must ask of music, and of the Prelude specifically, when does the piece begin? Surely it does not begin with C sharp. The opening melody, a monophonic line of flute, does unfold from that note. Yet, to identify that note as the beginning of the piece would be inadequate. On the one hand, it would be inadequate because that note is of the flute. It is, in fact, of the breath. Before the sound of the pitch, then, comes the breath, silently establishing a rhythm that will underline the entire piece. This rhythm, the relationship between inhalation and exhalation, bears no resemblance yet to the meter or bar lines marked in the score. What one senses in the opening is the silence that transitions to the motion of duple and triple divisions. Is the life of the external world transformed through breath into the deep silver note of the flute. What one hears is the summoning and shaping of wind into columns of resonance, alignment, and amplification. It is as if the air itself had coalesced into a voice. Is not then this breath the beginning as much as the sounding of the C sharp? For it serves as a source of the first measure. On the other hand, to identify C sharp as the beginning of the piece would be inadequate because that note does not come from or go to anywhere at all in the musical phrase. It only arrives unsteadily at itself. One could hardly hear C sharp as a beginning until there had already been reiteration, in this case, a chromatic descent to G natural, and return to C sharp in measure 2. This melody is an arabesque. There is already a process of looping back and thus a process of reinstitution that signals this gesture as opening. The subtle difference between measure 1 and measure 2 lies in the temporal gap between their sounding, such that measure 2 confirms the expression of measure 1. And consequently, melodic line in measure 3 can then expand via G sharp in the direction, however faint the implication, of E major. The overall tonality of the piece. One hears the B natural at the end of measure 3 as the dominant of E major. A sense quickly subverted, however, by the melodic arrival of measure 4 on A sharp. Is not then C sharp in measure 2 the beginning as much as C sharp in measure 1? For it gives strength to measure 1, marking out its creative capacity for development. And so the initial C sharp in the flute looks too much backward and forward simultaneously to constitute a positive beginning or sovereign point of origin. It is already a beginning like that of mythical time, retrograde movement in futuro, as Merleau-Ponty writes. The transformation then from silence to motion in the prelude occurs through structural doubling. Sound is never the absolute negation of silence, but emerges as a coiling up over silence, the blossoming of breath into song and of repetition into feeling. There is doubling of the external and internal world thanks to the silvery swirl of the breath through the flute, and this intertwining is that of the flesh. There is doubling of the past and the present thanks to the repetition of melodic lines, and this encroachment is that of rhythm. The vitality, the motion of music is rooted in the excess. The emotion that springs from this intertwining and encroachment. Debussy's entire prelude unfolds as a series of doubles that open up multiple dimensions of expression. Many of these doubles disclose themselves within the first 30 measures of the piece, creating a beginning of depth, a beginning that folds through itself. The motion that these doubles generate does not pause until the cadence in B major at measure 30, which we just heard about 10 seconds ago, but here it is again. That's bar 30 there with the resolution. Therefore, we will focus on these opening 30 measures, on the horn motif during measures 4 and 10, the oboe and strings during measures 17 through 20, and finally, the flute melody itself. Perhaps after 30 measures of analysis, we will better understand the nature of the beginning that Debussy offers us. In measure 4, we hear the first harmonic sonority of the piece as the woodwinds and harp enter on the second beat. As nebulous in function, an A-sharp half-diminished 7th chord, as the flute line, and focused still upon the upper voices of the orchestra, oboes and clarinets, the entrance of the woodwinds and harp neither resolves the tension of the opening melody nor pushes to a new development. It is the first horn, an instrument that, like the flute, resonates by means of the human breath, but this time offering a rich timbre of gold that lends pulse to the measure with a soft, syncopated entrance, leading to an expressive call, F, B flat, A flat, in measure 5, echoed by the syncopated dyad in the lower third horn. It is as if the idea of the flute melody, so concentrated in its half and whole steps and so tightly bound in registers until C sharp minor 7th outline in measure 3, combined with the woodwinds and harp in measure 4, could close into itself and disintegrate if not for the wide gesture in the horn of measure 5. Measure 5, too, expands in register through the B flat, 7th chord, in the basses and the muted lower strings, cello and violas. This B flat is connected certainly to the A sharp with which the flute melody ended, here respelled enharmonically, but strikes the ear immediately as a new sound. It is an extraordinary rich moment of color, this sonorous world of basses. It is a moment of B flats and A flats that rise out of A sharps and G sharps of the previous measure as enharmonic respellings that move from the sharp side to the flat side of the circle of fifths. And then in measure 6, there is silence, an entire measure of silence written into the score. The footnote here says, the circle of fifths in tonal harmony refers to relationships between different tonal areas or key centers. The circle moves in one direction by descending fifths, by means of the addition of flats to the key signature, and in the other direction by ascending fifths, by means of additional sharps, so that from the top of the circle at C major, which has no flats or sharps, the progression moves through closely related keys until it arrives at the most distant key, F sharp, or G flat major. The two are enharmonically equivalent. That is to say, they use different note names to refer to the same pitch class. Usually, the circle of fifths is represented as a clock face with key position like the numerals of the clock. Keys that are positioned closer together on the clock share a multitude of common tones. For example, key signatures of C major and G major differ only by one accidental, F natural in C major as opposed to F sharp in G major. Keys that are positioned across from each other on the clock, separated as one can see by the interval of a tritone, are the most distantly related, sharing only one common tone. For example, the major scale on C and the major scale on F sharp share only the pitch B as a common tone, excluding the enharmonic spelling of F in C major as E sharp in F sharp major. Therefore, modulation to closely related keys can be relatively smooth, for modulation to the very distant related ones can have a jarring effect. And the relationship between the most distant related keys to the interval of the tritone, i.e., 6 half steps, is the most dissonant. The harmonic conventions, which are operative in virtually all of classical repertoire, are the very parameters against which Debussy plays. End of footnote. At this moment, following the silence of bar 6, the music has shifted so much, as if, through the enharmonic accidentals, the piece had been rotated like a kaleidoscope, that it reveals a gap, a break in the movement of the arabesque. The motion must go back. It must return to itself, coil under itself, in order to continue. The silence of measure 6, therefore, stands at the center of a double. The rupture is followed by resumption in measure 7, the material from measure 4. But now with the muted violins and not the woodwinds sustaining the harmony. Again, the first horn, in a syncopated pulse, issues an expressive call, and the third horn echoes above the rich bass sonority of the B-flat 7th chord. The horns repeat their gesture through measure 9, sustaining a suspension and resolving quietly into the D major triad at measure 11. Again on the sharp side of the circle of fifths, where the flute melody returns. It is this silence of measure 6, following the rupture of timbre, register, and harmony in measure 5, that demonstrates Debussy's achievement of the depth of non-coincidence through music. In a letter to a friend, Debussy comments upon this aspect of his compositional style. Quote, "I made use, quite spontaneously, moreover, of a means that seems to me fairly rare. I mean silence," don't laugh, "as an agent of expression, and perhaps the only way of making the emotion of a phrase gain its true weight." End quote. Measure 6, therefore, is not actually an empty measure. It is an evocation of the silence from which expression emerges, the non-coincidence from which emotion is generated. Through these opening measures, and especially the silence in measure 6, the whole piece is conceived. Of course, we hear all of this only in retrospect and locally, only after the flute has re-entered in measure 11 with the arabesque. This time, however, the melody is linked not with an expressive call of the horns, which instead move in conjunct chromatic steps, but with a transition through the oboe to a new melodic gesture in measure 17. Here, the oboe shines brightly on the melody, ascending from A sharp that it borrows from the flute. The harmony, no longer the B-flat 7th chord of measure 5, which had, in that context, seemed so dark and rich, but now an enharmonically respelled A sharp 7th chord, oscillates by means of half-step movement from C double sharp up to D sharp, and also A sharp up to B natural, with E sharp half diminished 7th chord, confirmed by measure 19. It is as if, in measure 17, the idea of B-flat's 7th chord from measure 5 had shifted from a cool to a bright timbre, i.e. from horn to oboe. And from a rich to a shining harmony, i.e. from the flat side of the circle of fifths in measure 5 to the sharp side in measure 17. The shift in harmony from an A sharp 7th chord to an E sharp half diminished 7th chord occurs at the end of measure 17 and is repeated in measure 18. Measure 18, therefore, coils back to measure 17, emphasizing the oscillating harmonic motion, but adding, as the excess of color that such reinstitution generates, muted violins to the oboe melody, the first melodic line to be heard in the violins. This has the effect of sweetening the reedy oboe sound, and the music reaches a forte dynamic level for the first time. It is here that the piece opens up, expands, and reverberates. The B-flat or A-sharp sonority as a double from measures 5 and 8 and then 17 and 18 begins to realize the possibility of its generative power. What, then, of the flute arabesque that weaves itself through these full orchestral moments? We have already noted the opening flute melody contains its own interior double. That is to say, according to the repetition between measure 1 and 2, but it establishes its function as a structural double in its performance as a whole as well. Its repetition offers a kind of musical depth, new harmonies, timbres, and melodic figurations. Following the expressive horn call of B-flat sonority in measure 5, the flute melody returns in measure 11 unmodified, except because any return must encompass the excess that such a movement creates. For the new harmony, B major, in the accompanying strings, and the clear sense of rhythmic pulse that the accompaniment provides. Measure 21, following the oscillating harmonics and bright oboe melody of measures 17 through 19, marks another iteration of the flute arabesque, this time above the serenity of C sharp minor 7th. Here, the flute melody takes a new turn, fluttering through C sharp minor and landing upon the pitch A as the beginning of a new melodic sequence that dips down a fourth before climbing up to C natural, considered enharmonically to function as the B sharp leading to C sharp. On the downbeat of measure 26, which serves as yet another beginning for the arabesque. The second measure of the final arabesque in measure 27 is transformed, swirling around the descending and ascending figure of the tritone in alternation between the first and second flutes, until both flutes make a rapid ascent together in measure 28, where they languidly descend in triplet turns over to F sharp 9th chord, leading finally to the cadence in measure 30 in B major. The descending motion of the flutes, along with the strong tonal relationship between F sharp and B, descent of a perfect fifth, contributes to the strength of this cadence, the first in the entire piece. Certainly, we hear the arabesque differently in each of its entrances, not only because of the qualitative shift associated with the passage of time itself, but also because of the new musical material that intervenes. Yet, the arabesque does not simply profit from a juxtaposition of different melodies and harmonies. Instead, it is as if each iteration of the arabesque gives birth to another layer of depth, and thus another layer of possible expression. Because the flute melody contains its own interior double, this double bears a capacity for inventiveness. In each of the returning arabesque statements, therefore, it seems to be in the moment of the double that change springs forth. For just as the melody folds in upon itself, does it open a new dimension? This is how we can understand the variation of the arabesque that occurs in measure 22 and in 27, as corresponding to the second measure or double of the initial melody. This repetition is productive, not merely reproductive. It lends each phrase into a structurally significant harmonic area. A B ninth chord in measure 23, leading to E in measure 26, a movement accomplished by means of descending perfect fifth, and an F sharp ninth chord in measure 28, leading to B in measure 30, as mentioned above, a movement of a descending perfect fifth. And so, in the prelude, we begin to hear Merleau-Ponty's sense of mythical time, where, as we have seen, a certain event in the beginning maintains a continued efficacy. This beginning cannot be pinpointed to the opening of the flute solo, the harmony of measure 5, the silence of measure 6, the melody of measure 17, or the cadence in measure 30. Each of these moments serves as a beginning only in retrospective. Their continued efficacy does not so much mark them out as causes as it underlines their operation as effects. In mythical time, the beginning comes through the middle. It does not initiate the events, it unfolds through them. Merleau-Ponty writes that while listening to beautiful music, he has, quote, the impression that this movement that starts up is already at its endpoint, which it is going to have been, or that it is sinking into the future, that we have a hold of as well as the past, end quote. This intertwining of past, present, and future opens up the expressive world of the prelude. Indeed, the flute arabesque is woven throughout the whole of the piece, not just the first 30 measures. It returns quite recognizably in measure 79 in the flute, transposed up a minor third to begin on E, and in measure 86 in the oboe, transposed up a diminished third to begin on E flat. In measure 94, the melody appears in both flutes at its original pitch level, that is to say, C sharp. This signals an important structural event in the musical form. From that point to the end of the piece, the arabesque is almost constantly present. In measure 100 of the flute and cello through measure 102 in repeated fragments. In the oboe in measure 103 and 104, and finally in measure 107 in the muted horn. The colors of these instruments, oboe, flute, horn, evoke the opening section of the piece, measures 1 through 30, in which the arabesque was first heard. This expressive sense of repetition confirms the depth that the piece has traversed. The melody coils back to a reinitiation that is non-coincident. In this way, the beginning and the end hold together. The final written measure of the piece, measure 110, offers an 8-note pizzicato in the lower strings on the downbeat, but otherwise sustains a motion of complete silence. It is a silence that returns to that of the very opening, the one that was transformed through breath into the silver note of the flute. Indeed, no way does the piece end with the last sounding pizzicato of E major. Every live performance and every recording sustains a certain resonance through the final measure and beyond. It is not an audible so much as a felt resonance, an expressive silence.